Everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. This video is going to be giving you information and instructions on the final exam, and then once I get through with that discussion, there are some things on the review sheet I'll talk about. So let's get into it. This probably won't be the longest video, but in terms of the logistics of the exam, it's going to be the same as your quizzes, right? You've been taking these online quizzes on Moodle, and you'll be accessing the final exam at the same location on our course Moodle page. Here, this is what it looks like to me. You can see it's listed final exam. You probably won't be able to see this if you're watching this video prior to 8 a.m. on Monday. But starting at 8 a.m. on Monday, you will have the chance to, at any time between then and Friday, you'll click this link and you'll have 3 hours to complete the exam once you begin it. So this is going to be formatted pretty similarly to the first exam that we had. You recall back then we have, as the review sheet is suggesting, multiple choice. We have some essay questions. I'll talk more about that in a second, but here, just know the exam is going to be available Monday through Friday. Like I said, Monday, 8 a.m. is when it will go live. You'll need to complete it before Friday at 11:59 p.m. We get into Saturday, 12 o'clock a.m., the exam will go away and you won't be able to take it. So at some point within that time frame, make sure you're taking the exam. So you have all week on the first week of finals to take it, as I just mentioned. So this is a convenience option I'm giving to you guys. Please, though, do not discuss the content of this exam with anyone. This is something that I would like to keep. Obviously, it's not going to be a proctored exam. That's kind of the downside of our online format right now. We don't have really effective options that I can implement in the context of this semester to proctor the exam in the remote setting. So please just do me the favor of not discussing the content with anyone. If you are getting wind of people discussing the exam content, please let me know. But just please avoid that for me. In terms of, let's see, what else? In terms of the timing, again, just anytime within the week, just make sure you get it done by Friday. My office hours will be going on Wednesday, but I'll be available to talk either through email or remotely through Zoom at any time during the week as well. There will probably be things that, if you ask questions that are very specific about questions on the exam, I might not give you specific answers since we are in an exam setting now. But feel free to contact me if you want. If you're somebody who has any sort of accommodation letter that requires additional time, should have been accounted for already. So you should be ready to go to take the exam whenever you want to during the week. Here, getting into the specifics, the content is listed. It's these 4 chapters we've covered since the first exam: Congress, the presidency, the bureaucracy, the judiciary. In terms of the multiple choice, there's going to be 65 questions. Okay, they're going to be counting for 1 point each, so 65 total points. In terms of the essays, you will have 3 total, 20 points each. So each of your 3 essays, you'll have four options, I should say, of which you will choose 3, and whichever one you don't want to answer, you can leave that off. So pretty similar to the first test. For a total of 125 points. You'll note here 60 points total for the essay questions. So roughly speaking, these are equal in weight for your final grade. The multiple choice is just slightly worth slightly more than the essays in this case. So you can, when you get into the test, if need be, allocate your time accordingly. And so when you get your grade back, I will rescale it to a 100-point scale. But just note, when you see 125, that's there to illustrate the weighting here. Just that the multiple choice and the essay questions are accounting for roughly equal parts of this total of 125 points. Other than that, I think that was about what I wanted to say as far as the instructions and the logistics of the exam. If there's anything that you think I'm leaving out or anything that you're confused on, or you think I'm confused on, please feel free to let me know. But I think that's about it as far as the instructions. Again, pretty similar in format to our first test, and the way you're taking this test is going to be pretty similar to these online quizzes you've had a couple of times now. That being said, let me discuss here a little bit on the review sheet. So this was put out yesterday at this point being Saturday. I'm recording this on Sunday afternoon. You'll note that, roughly speaking, this goes in order of the topics we've discussed, to where everything above this line is Congress. Everything, these two items, the presidency, these two, the bureaucracy, and then the judiciary, everything below. Okay. And so you have actually the benefit of our online format. You know, there are downsides, of course, but the benefit of our new online format is that you have all of these lectures available on the YouTube playlist. So if there are items here that you're confused about, maybe confused, I keep using the word confused isn't the best word, I guess, but if there are items that you need to revisit, the option is there in the video lectures that are on YouTube for you to watch on demand. All right, so you can do that. You can go back through these lectures and the notes I present there. If that's not enough, I guess you could also get in touch with me. That's fine. But I think for our purposes, the fact that we have all these existing videos, I'm not going to belabor and repeat all of these points, just because you have them on demand in our YouTube playlist. The congressional lecture, though, you recall, this was our last topic that we got through prior to spring break. So this is where we left off our in-person lectures. So we don't have the corresponding video lectures for these. And so in my discussion here, I'm going to go through these, and you can look at the presidency, bureaucracy, and judiciary on your own if need be. I will go back through what we talked about and review these topics on Congress. So that's what I'll focus on. Before getting into that, so you have the notes in the video lectures for these other chapters for Congress. If any of you guys want the notes, maybe you didn't, maybe you misplaced them, maybe you lost them, maybe you just didn't take them. I'll go back through what I have. So this would be our in-class notes from this chapter. I'm just going to scroll through these, slowly, but not too slowly. And then if you need them, you can pause the video and either record them on your own or just do whatever you want with it. But these are notes for Congress. And as I'm going through this, I'll probably get self-conscious about my handwriting, but if there's anything that you need to discuss in these notes, feel free to get in touch with me. Here's our lawmaking process. Representation. I believe there's another page of notes after this one as well, which I'll go through. Here we're talking about gerrymandering. This would be contiguity and compactness. Those shapes, gerrymandering. You recall we did an in-class activity on gerrymandering, which was fun for everyone. Committees and appropriations. Okay, so those are one page of notes. I believe we may have another page on Congress. Lawmaking again. I thought we already had lawmaking, but maybe this is just, I think these are just notes that I copy and pasted for some purpose, but yeah, these are the same from the previous page. All right, so there you have it. Those are all the notes on Congress. So if you need them, you have them now. Let me go through here and discuss some of what's on this review sheet as far as Congress goes. So qualifications for the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So for each of these, we talked about things like residency requirements and age requirements, that sort of thing. The tip I'd give you here is maybe also, you recall we emphasized one particular aspect of the requirements for the presidency, which differs from those for Congress. Okay, and I'm not gonna, I'll let you do the work there if you need to go back and revisit that. But try to figure out, if it's not already obvious, what is the difference in the qualifications for the presidency? Something that's there that isn't there for the House and the Senate. Not a difficult question to really figure out on your own, so I'll leave it at that. Maybe for this heading, just focus on that. What are the differences between what you need to have in terms of qualifications for the presidency versus Congress? Selection for the House, the Senate, and the President. In terms of the President, what I would leave you with here, we talked about the Electoral College. Okay, we didn't get fully into this, but this is a topic that if we had a chance to get through all of the material, we talk about the Electoral College and elections a lot more in general. One of those unfortunate things about the interruption here that we didn't get through all the material I had intended to. The Electoral College, the key here is that this is the institution established in the Constitution to select the president. And so for presidential elections, we have indirect elections, whereas for the House and the Senate, we have direct elections. In the House, we have direct elections within each congressional district. For the Senate, we have direct elections within the entirety of a state. Okay, here again, just in terms of tips, things to maybe be aware of. In terms of the House and the Senate, I just mentioned they both have direct elections. We've talked about how this was not always the case for one of these chambers. Okay, so maybe go back and review that. How has the either direct or indirect election for one of these chambers changed over time? So that's maybe something for you to go and look at if you need to. Representation. Relatively broad terms. So in general, representation corresponds to just how closely the will of the people, or in what manner maybe the will of the people is carried out by elected officials. And so we talked about these two different, and I think this is just in the notes I scrolled through as well, these two different types of representation, the delegate model and a trustee model. Okay. So here again, I just showed you the notes, and you should probably have notes on your own, so I don't need to go through the whole discussion here. In terms of what I would emphasize is just knowing what the difference between these two models of representation is. It's a fairly distinct differentiation here, so that shouldn't be an issue for you. One of these models involves more of a direct correspondence to the will of the people. One of them involves less correspondence to the will of the people. Another discussion we had on the topic of representation involved different models. In other words, these two models, maybe one of them applying more frequently to the House of Representatives, and then the other applying more directly to the Senate. And so maybe go back and figure that out as well. Which of these is applying more so to the House? Which of these models is applying more so to the Senate? Next on our list here, impeachment. So this is a discussion to where we actually had the ability to directly talk about ongoing impeachment events. I think this is the first time in terms of my experience teaching that I've actually got to discuss an ongoing impeachment. And in fact, it definitely is the first time, at least an ongoing presidential impeachment. So here, you want to be aware of what impeachment is. If that's something that you're confused on, then maybe go back and reacquaint yourself with the term impeachment. So it's involving congressional action to potentially remove an official in either the executive branch or judicial branch. And in terms of the process, you also want to be aware of what the different steps are. We talked about this being a two-step process, beginning in the House and then progressing into the Senate. Okay. And so you want to be aware of what's going on in each of these different chambers progressively. So in the House, they pass what are known as articles of impeachment, basically the indictment. In the Senate, they have a trial. If the House does pass articles of impeachment to determine whether or not the accused official is actually removed from office. So that's the overall process. Maybe be aware of what the threshold in the House is to pass articles of impeachment. Maybe also be aware of what the threshold is in the Senate to actually remove an impeached official. And then finally, if I were to ask you the question, how many past or present presidents have been impeached? You'd want to know the answer to that. If I were to ask you a corresponding question about how many past or current presidents, current doesn't make sense in this question, but how many past presidents have been removed from office? You can't be a current president, obviously, if you've been removed. You want to be aware of the answer to that question as well. And hopefully it's obvious what the difference between those two questions is. Impeachment versus impeachment and removal. We've discussed this in class before, so I think everyone is mostly on board with that at this point. The lawmaking process. This is something I'm definitely not going to go through the entire lawmaking process. However, we discussed this in class at length. These are the notes I just showed you. Things, we went from the beginning all the way to the end. A bill being introduced, action in committee, progressing on to, if it gets through committee, to a full vote on the chamber floor of either the House or the Senate. If it passes the House or the Senate, or House and the Senate, excuse me, eventually going on to the president, and the president having some options. So this is the process I'm talking about. I would have a pretty comprehensive knowledge if I were you guys going into the test of this process. Just I mean, there aren't too many specific steps here, so I don't think that's beyond anyone. I would also just try to get a general sense of how, what the progress is from the start to the beginning, right? Just how, what is the purpose of each of these steps? How do they link to one another? And just have an overall sense of how a bill becomes law, right? So this is a process I would say we went into some detail on. Okay, so this is, if you do, it's worth noting, if you do actually understand everything that's happening here, you have a pretty good understanding of the lawmaking process. You have a much better understanding of the average person who has the schoolhouse rock understanding of lawmaking than you have a better sense of that, right? If you actually go into the details of the minutia here, that's, I guess, not important for the test why you needed to learn it, but I just wanted to give everyone a pretty sound and robust sense of lawmaking, just because that's the main, we discussed the primary role of Congress. Congress does a few different things other than lawmaking, but lawmaking is really their bread and butter. It's why it's why a legislative body exists as an institution, to pass legislation. And so we spent a fair bit of time talking about that process, and I would just revisit that overall discussion in anticipation of the test. We talked about, speaking of congressional powers, so we talked about how the House and the Senate, more often than not, they're doing similar things. You look at the House today and the Senate today, they're both working on legislation for the most part dealing with the coronavirus. Those are the major issues at play today. And in general, the House and the Senate, they're both focusing on legislation, right? They both exist to pass laws. However, there are several, I would say, noteworthy exclusive powers of each, and that's something you'll want to revisit as well. In our notes, I think that was one of the first things we talked about, the exclusive powers of the House and the Senate, this section here. So things involving impeachment down here, there are different roles in the impeachment process. In terms of other exclusive powers, we talked about in the House, how going back to the constitutional framing of these two chambers, the founders decided to give the taxation power, at least the power to initiate taxation legislation with the House. The Senate would eventually still have to sign on and pass any taxation legislation that comes from the House, but has to start in the House. On the Senate side of things, they have these interesting powers involving the approval of appointments for the president. We talked about this process a lot during this semester. The president making an appointment, and then the Senate having to approve of the appointment with a majority vote. And then, the treaty ratification process, we talked about that also being an exclusive power of the Senate. Supermajority, 2/3 majority needed to ratify a treaty in the Senate. And so again, I'd emphasize these different thresholds whenever in my notes or whenever I discuss in class. I specifically pointed out majority versus supermajority. You'll want to be aware of those different thresholds. I would just reiterate that. Here, amendments pertaining to the Congress and the presidency. I was going back on my own, trying to recall all of the different amendments I had discussed prior to our break. In terms of what I would emphasize, on the test, I think the ones that I'm going to ask about, and here I'll just give you just some bonus hints, which are probably more than I should give you, but be aware of the 12th Amendment, be aware of the 17th Amendment in particular. We've talked about more than that as well. I was just trying to lighten the load on you a little bit by not, by narrowing down this topic a little bit. But those are the ones I think that are going to appear on the test, 17th and 12th. redistricting. This is getting back to our discussion, on gerrymandering. Obviously, that was the ultimate conclusion of our discussion on redistricting, the concept of gerrymandering and how that works. Overall, redistricting, it's just referring to the process whereby every once in a while we have to reassign congressional representation to correspond with the current population breakdown in each state. Specifically, every 10 years, we have a census. I actually, a few weeks ago, got my census notification. I guess they're doing most of it online, so I filled out my census form online. I'm sure many of you, if you're independent of your, I think, I don't know. I don't know whether you get one if you're technically still a dependent or not. But if you are someone who's going to receive a census, you would have either done so recently, or you will, I presume, in the near future, be getting a census form. We have the census every 10 years to count the number of people in the country and the number of people in each state, and then we reapportion our 435 seats in the House toward each state, depending on the number of people in each state. Okay? So redistricting occurs when the number of seats is changing in some state, and they have to go from, in North Carolina, we're anticipating going from 13 districts up to 14. I think that's the most common estimate that I'm seeing, that will go from 13 to 14. So we'll need to redistrict following the census if that occurs. The state of North Carolina has engaged in redistricting for other reasons in recent history, based on the congressional map being thrown out for certain reasons. Gerrymandering, being one of them. Either racial gerrymandering, which we've had some Supreme Court rulings against involving North Carolina. We've had state Supreme Court rulings more recently involving partisan gerrymandering, and so there's been a lot of redistricting going on in recent history in the state of North Carolina, more so than what we would usually have to do just based on the decennial census. A couple more headings here: congressional committees. We talked about three broad categories in particular of committees: standing committees. We talked about select committees. Talked about joint committees. To where standing, we're talking about permanent committees, dealing with these broad areas of policy, which are for the most part perpetual to where we want an existing committee with some stability over time. A select committee, usually speaking, a temporary committee which has a specific job in mind, where they'll do whatever the investigation is or whatever the task is, complete it, issue whatever their deliverable is, a report or a piece of legislation, and then the committee will go away and cease to exist. And then a joint committee, this is a committee that's specifically bringing members from both chambers of Congress into the committee. So when we're talking about select committees or standing committees, these are involving membership from only the House or the Senate. A joint committee is bringing membership from both the House and the Senate together. The most common form of a joint committee we talked about was a conference committee, to where at the end of the legislative process, or at least getting toward the end of the legislative process, if the House and the Senate have passed different versions of the same legislation, to where it's the same overall thing that's being passed, but there are differences that have emerged either maybe in markup or in the amendment process on the floor. A conference committee takes those two disparate pieces of legislation, reconciles whatever the difference is, and produces what's known as a conference report, which is an identical version to be voted on at the House and the Senate. So that's the most common form of a joint committee we talked about. And the last heading here under, the last one I'm going to talk about under our congressional chapter involves appropriations. And so a few things I would point out with respect to appropriations. We talked about the overall process here, that money's, appropriations, we're talking about the spending of money, is taking two steps usually, right? Authorization happens, and then appropriations. Okay, where the authorization step, this is not actually spending money. This is saying, this is for passing a law to establish a new policy or some new agency in government maybe, giving legal authority to fund this new program or agency or whatever we're talking about here. So the authorization is just setting up the new program to actually spend money. So authorization, generally speaking, will only need to take place once for most programs, for most departments or agencies. Appropriations is the actual spending of money that has to happen on a yearly basis, right? So every year, every fiscal year, which is running from October the 1st, we talked about through September the 30th. And every year, the federal government has to pass money to spend during a fiscal year through this appropriations process. This is what we refer to as regular appropriations, what I just described. Every year, there's supposed to be a set of appropriations bills in place by October the 1st to fund everything that's going on in the federal government for that fiscal year. We talked about how, just based on the overall level of dysfunction in Congress and things like polarization, that the regular appropriations process is usually very contentious and difficult to complete. And so you'd have to go back many years to actually find a time in which the regular appropriations were completed on time. And what usually happens is we'll get to October the 1st and the regular appropriations negotiations will still be going on. And so Congress passes what's known as a continuing resolution, which is a stopgap measure. A continuing resolution would say we're going to fund all of the programs, all of the different parts of government at the same level as we did in the previous fiscal year for maybe an additional month or maybe an additional 2 months, however long Congress wants to allocate to conclude the regular appropriations negotiations. And so very often in contemporary politics, we're running on a continuing resolution as opposed to a regular appropriations bill or set of regular appropriations bills. And then finally, supplemental appropriations. This term is applying to sort of emergency funding, things that aren't included in either in sort of the regular appropriations negotiations. We have in general, this would be things like natural disasters. Sometimes war or conflict spending would be part of a supplemental appropriation. We've had supplemental appropriations now passed for the COVID-19 outbreak, which is another example here of when they might be used. So that's I think where I'll leave it as far as appropriations goes. And like I said, I'm gonna wrap up the review here just because, again, if you have anything you wanted to go back over, which hopefully you do go back over all these things, you have all my recorded lectures for these topics between these lines. That said, if you want to talk more about anything that I said in my review of Congress or any of these other chapters, please get in touch with me. I'd be more than happy to talk with you about them. Obviously, I won't get into to specific details of what's going to appear on the test, and if we get into a point to where you're asking about specifics on the test or anything like that, I'd probably just have to decline. But if you do have questions, let me know about anything on the review sheet, about maybe if there's anything that wasn't clear earlier in the video about my discussion of the setup of the test, the instruction of the test. Please stay in communication with me. So that's it for now. I'll be back in touch as the semester wraps up to give you updates on things like reminders about the test. When I have the final grades calculated, you'll get a notification from me about that. But anyway, thanks everyone. I hope everyone's hanging in there. I know seeing this semester, it's difficult under normal circumstances, and I hope it's manageable for you all. I hope you're all healthy and hanging in there. As we wrap things up, good luck with the final, good luck with your other finals, and I'll talk to you all later.